Why, hello there, old sports. Within the world of Hollow Knight, and the kingdom of Hallownest specifically, various bugs, beasts, and gods populate the dying, broken world in which the game takes place. But to me, the most interesting faction aren't the strange and powerful higher beings, not the territorial bees who end up being mostly unaffected by the plague due to their previous hive mind, not even the proud mantises who had the wills strong enough to fend off the infection, but instead, a group of beings who are considered not bugs, nor beasts, nor gods. Now, of course, if you have basic knowledge of the game, or just read the title of the video you're watching, you know I'm talking about the Vessels, which, while I'm not sure if they're more of a faction, race, or just a group, they are most certainly extremely interesting to me. Now, to the inevitable group of people who have no idea what a Hollow Knight even is, or just for people who aren't confident about the lore, or even those who are just rusty, I'll give a short rundown on who and what the Vessels are. The Vessels were all born of a union between the Pale King and his queen, the White Lady. Both of these characters are stated to be both pale beings and higher beings. Higher beings within the world of Hallownest are basically just the title of godlike beings. Pale beings are a bit more confusing, but for the purposes of this video, let's just say they're equal to, but different to, higher beings for now. The Vessels are described by their father to have soul of root and worm. Again, those are just the species and just names that the two parent characters fit into. Curiously, we don't know if the Vessels themselves are higher beings. Now at first, this may seem like an obvious yes, because God plus God should equal God, or God squared. But the Vessels are described to be and not to be gods a few times, so it's kind of up in the air. Now, there are lore tablets that say higher beings, these words are for you alone, and we know other mortal bugs can't understand the tablets, while our character, who is a Vessel, can. But then again, we as the player might be able to read them, while our character cannot. Because canonically, humans exist as gods in-universe, but that's a whole can of worms I don't want to get into right now, and I'm already off topic enough. Besides being born of gods, the most other important aspect of the Vessels is the Void. Void within Hollow Knight is also another mysterious, powerful force like the higher beings. At the bottom of the abyss where the Void is located is found a subsection called the Birthplace. Now within said birthplace is an egg with Void tendrils attached and buried into it. The birthplace is described as where the Vessels were both born and where they died. Now my interpretation of this is that the eggs containing the offspring of the Pale King and the White Lady were dropped into the abyss by the Pale King, or the Void was allowed to encase the eggs. From there, the Void consumed the eggs and hollowed out the creatures within. The reason the Vessels aren't bugs or beasts or gods are because they technically aren't even alive. What they are in reality is the lingering will of the dead children that's been imprinted onto the Void, which is then contained within the remaining shell of those said dead children. The Vessels aren't living beings, they're living ghosts. It makes sense that ghost is the specific word Hornet uses to describe them. Considering she probably knows the most about the Void out of, literally anyone except maybe the Pale King. At least in the modern age of Hallownest. And by modern age, I mean, Pale King's arrival to the time you play the game. Now, an unnecessarily long description of the basics of Vessels aside, you might be wondering, what reason would that prick have to throw his kids into the Void? Now, first of all, if anyone is interested, I'd love to make a pseudo Defense of the Pale King video. Second of all, if you forget, the Pale King was specifically doing this to create a purely hollow vessel to contain the radiance and stop the infection. Now, if you played the game for more than 5 minutes, you probably know how that plan went. Anyways, so far I've basically just been giving a summary of what the Vessels are, but not who they are. The funny thing about that is that the Vessels aren't really supposed to be people. They weren't even intended to be sentient. They were supposed to be a mix of a mindless golem and a really strong box. They're basically Thaumiel SCPs, if that's a less complicated explanation to anyone. Now, with a nearly 800-word intro out of the way, I'd like to talk about the 3 Vessels we know the most about, and then after that I'd like to talk a bit more about what they are as characters, and ultimately try to treat them as living creatures, instead of a tool. At least as much as you can for a fictional character. But before getting into the Vessels we know more about, I'd like to quickly go over the other Vessels we see throughout Hallownest. Now all of them, are corpses, but we can still extract some characterization from their remains. Starting from the bottom of the world and going up, we have the Abyss, where most of the Vessels are found. In fact, the entire floor of the main Abyss chasm is made up of vessel shells. Below that is the birthplace, which is a cave system made up of vessel corpses, including load-bearing corpses, which are my favorite. This also implies the main abyss chasm goes deeper than we see, but the abyss itself isn't the main purpose of this video essay. Again, if anyone wanted to see one, I'd love to make a deep dive about the abyss itself. Anyways, the YouTuber CC Mackay estimated in a video that the abyss could have around 1 to 2 million vessels from what we see alone. Even assuming many children could be born from each egg, the king and queen must have had thousands of eggs on a low end, assuming they could make one, or they could make like a lot of children at once per egg, due to the white lady being a tree creature, because trees make a lot of seeds at once. Anyways, it's hard to wrap your head around, but even 100,000 is a huge number, let alone 10 or 20 times that. Think about all those lives lost, all that unclaimed potential, all those bonds never formed, etc., etc. It's even more horrifying if you realize that you need to kill 35 times that amount to reach the low end of the lives lost to the Black Plague. So, that's depressing. Regardless, all we know about these vessels is that they failed to ascend from the abyss, and at least a few of them climbed up before falling back down and dying. Or maybe they died on the climb and then their corpses fell down, who knows. Moving up a little, we find a few vessel corpses strung up in Nosk's lair by the beast itself. I'd assume Nosk used the same strategy that it used on us, on our siblings, to lure them in. Now, even if all those vessels died to Nosk, the fact that they were able to escape the abyss and survive Deepness that long to die to Nosk in the first place is impressive by itself. Speaking of escaping the abyss, the vessels were presumably able to climb up the central abyss chasm, found some sort of hidden cave system that we'd never find, and then that led up to Deepness and they went from there. Team Chariot stated they don't know exactly how the vessels escaped the abyss, but I think that itself is supposed to tell us that it isn't really important beyond the fact that they did, if that makes sense. Like, it's not as important how they did it, just the fact that they did do it, I guess. Like, I feel like that could easily be explained away by, oh yeah, there's just some cave that we never get to access in the dimensions we see in the game. Or like, from our perspective of a 2D game, there's some sort of cave system that leads up to deep. I don't know, you get what I mean. Or hopefully you get what I mean, I don't know. The final vessel I want to talk about in this section is the vessel found in Hornet's Greenpath Arena. Now this vessel is mostly interesting because it drops the Mothwing Cloak. I want to talk about the Mothwing Cloak and its implications later, but I'll get to that later. The only other thing to mention is that this vessel seems to have died to Hornet and stabbed with its own nail. It makes sense that Hornet expected to kill us this easily, or she expected to kill us easily, considering she's probably killed a few other vessels like that one. The first of the notable individual vessels is the Broken Vessel, aka Lost Kin. We find this vessel in the ancient basin laying in front of the entrance to the room where the monarch wing flies are found. The Wanderer's Journal book states that the vessel has skills with a nail, and has retained many of its skills after its reanimation. The vessel is also bigger than our player character, and most other vessels we see throughout the game, sans the Hollow Knight. While I think that most vessels we see are child vessels, and the Hollow Knight is an adult vessel, I think the Broken Vessel is an adolescent or teenage vessel, if that makes any sense. Now for the next few bits of the video, I'm going to be going into complete theory and speculation territory, but it's going somewhere, I promise. Now since the Pure Vessel was described it's described to be raised to prime form, the vessels might struggle to develop on their own, which makes sense considering they are literal newborn children. The vessels also seem to wander upwards throughout the kingdom until they leave into the wilds beyond Hallownest. The only thing that makes our player character different is that it actually lived long enough to get that far. Now this raises the question, why is the Broken Vessel down in the ancient basin despite looking like it's grown more than any other vessels, again, besides the Hollow Knight? Now my theory is that the Broken Vessel was supposed to be the Hollow Knight before being deemed effective, and once that happened, its training and support ceased. Wanting to make something useful out of his failure, the Pale King left the Broken Vessel to guard the Monarch wings that he left behind. The Hollow Knight and Broken Vessel are also shown to be able to dash, which implies they somehow have the Mothwing Cloak as part of their biology. I think this sort of shows that the Mothwing Cloak is part of the vessel's biology somehow. However, that's just speculation, and maybe the Broken Vessel and Pure Vessel were just trained to do that while we had to use extra equipment to achieve such a feat. I can't speak English correctly. Once we encounter the Broken Vessel, we initially find it dead, but once we attempt to pass it, tons of light seeds, physical just creatures made of infection, swarm the vessel and stuff themselves into its hollowed-out body before using it like a puppet. Now, the fight itself isn't too interesting beyond the fact it shows that the vessel was skilled, but I already brought that up. Once you defeat the vessel, however, the infection leaks out of the body before the body goes limp. but unlike every other corpse in the game, the broken vessel gets back up for a moment to reach out before finally collapsing dead. Now this, as well as the fact that we fight the vessel again in its dreams, is extremely interesting, and it brings up many questions about the nature of the vessels. I also want to talk more about the vessel's hollowness in a later section, but for now, I just want to say that I don't think any of the vessels are actually truly hollow. The broken vessel has a mind and a will due to the fact it can dream. That's the most important thing I'm trying to say here. Again, the Lost Kin as a fight isn't too interesting from a lore perspective, considering the fact the vessel is being puppeted by the infection. With the Lost Kin, I'd argue that instead of being a puppet, the vessel is just remembering its previous fight with us, even though it's no longer infected. Once we defeat the vessel again and leave the dream, we see the uninfected vessel standing before us in its ghost form. Instead of being able to listen to it like the other two dream bosses, we're given the prompt to accept. Upon doing that, the vessel simply bows to us before dissipating into essence. Now again, the fact that vessels can even become ghosts and dream at all, in general, means a lot. Also, to mention the achievement to go into the achievement names for a moment, when we kill the broken vessel, we get the achievement Release, which is referring to the fact that we released the vessel from the infection. When we kill the Lost Kin, however, we get the achievement Peace. Now, I think this refers to the fact that we gave the vessel peace by defeating it. My idea/theory is that the broken vessel was in denial that it wasn't hollow until it was defeated. Like the other ghost, it comes to terms with its own failures, so upon accepting this, its spirit is able to move on. I've seen a few people argue that vessels don't have the equivalent to a soul, but I think they sort of do. The vessels aren't alive because what we see as vessels are the shades being contained in a shell. But the broken vessel, when it gets infected, is hollowed out. The void is gone from it. So in this circumstance, the leftover shell still has a soul, because the void is gone. We see that the void inherently is against life and essence and tries to consume it. So maybe the shell of the vessel can have a soul, but the void shade cannot. Regardless, let's move on. Next up, I want to talk about the Hollow Knight, aka Pure Vessel. Now, the Hollow Knight is my favorite character in the game, so just a short warning, I may be a bit biased. The Hollow Knight was titled so upon reaching the top of the abyss and reaching the Pale King before the others. Ironically, the Hollow Knight proves itself to not be hollow before even leaving the abyss, as it looks back at one of its siblings clinging to the nearby ledge. Perhaps it felt pity, or concern, or confusion, or just guilt for its sibling, but regardless, it followed its father out of the abyss. We see from two secrets within the palace that it was shown some parental affection. In the first, we find a slightly hidden room below a false floor containing what appears to be a nursery. This room is most likely where the Hollow Knight was raised by the White Lady for most of its life, and I'll get to why it was hidden later. The other secret we find is a bit harder to reach than just breaking a floor. This, of course, being the memory guarded behind the Path of Pain. Within this memory, we see the Pale King and Hollow Knight sharing a moment together. Now, I think the reason both of these were hidden away were because of what happens later, that of course being the Hollow Knight failing to fully snuff out the radiance. Regardless, the Hollow Knight's defect is not noticed yet, and it is raised and trained to prime form as described in the Hunter's Journal. We know from the lore tablets that in King's Pass that the higher beings have a unique ability to manipulate soul in ways that other mortal bugs cannot. We see this ability was taught to the Pure Vessel within its fight, as it is shown to not only create blades out of soul to attack us with, but it also uses a similar focus ability, albeit to summon damaging bursts of soul rather than using the soul to heal itself. Anyways, the Pure Vessel seems to wield a pure nail during its Godhome fight, and can seemingly create them for a brief moment during the pillar attack, showing an extreme mastery over soul and spells. The Pure Vessel is also the most emotional vessel we see. Well, maybe the Knight could take that title, but that's using a lot more inferences than the Pure Vessel. This may or may not be a hot take, but I consider its cut Dreamnail dialogue as the Pure Vessel canon, and I consider the cut Hollow Knight fight Dreamnail dialogue as not canon. This is because there was no reason to give the Pure Vessel Dreamnail dialogue once you knew this was the direction you were taking the character with. Also, Team Cherry denies that they even wrote the Dreamnail dialogue for the Pure Vessel in the first place, which is a...
I was actually using an advanced technique there called lying.
Yeah. Regardless, those lines of dialogue paint a very depressing picture showing the Hollow Knight, or the Pure Vessel, they're the same thing. It knows it isn't hollow, yet it's trying to do everything it can to force itself not to think, which ironically doing that, it's proving further how hollow it is not. I'll talk about hollowness more later, like I said, but let's move on to what we see from the Pure Vessel as the Hollow Knight. First of all, I'd like to bring up a line of dialogue from the White Lady where she mentions the Radiance has been within the Hollow Knight for ages. Now, taking the word ages literally, that means the Hollow Knight has been locked in that temple for at least a century. Also, to back this idea up, Assuming the normal bugs of Hallownest live about as long as regular people, Elderbug states that the stag stations closed before he was alive, and if he's around 70 or 80, which would make him elder, I guess, in my book, that lines up pretty well with the Hollow Knight being locked in there for around a century. Now imagine being locked in an empty room, strung up by chains, trying to subdue an angry deity within your very being, all while knowing you will fail. Like, I just want to give the Hollow Knight a blanket and a nice drink, give it a hug. Like, poor thing. Once we break it free of its bindings, it starts to fight us. Now in the first phase, it's fighting like it does as the pure vessel, mostly. Now after trying to contain the radiance for possibly a century, its body has been destroyed beyond repair. This is shown in the difference in speed between it and the pure vessel, and the fact that its attacks do 1 mask of damage instead of 2. It also doesn't use any spells, but this is due to the fact it quite literally cannot focus due to trying to contain the radiance. One thing I'd also like to mention is that in this fight, the Hollow Knight never uses any void-based attacks. Not even once. And only as the pure vessel, it only has 1 attack. I think this is extremely interesting, and I'll bring up this point later, but please keep in mind this idea of the pure vessels not using the power of the void they were born into. Personally, I think the pure vessel was taught to try to suppress the power of the void within itself by the Pale King to protect himself, considering the Pale King knew how dangerous the void was to a being like himself. And, yeah, that checks out. As the fight with the Hollow Knight goes on, it begins to fight less and less, and it loses the ability to use their normal nail attacks. As the fight continues on, more of its attacks come purely from the radiance, using the infection to defend itself under the concern that she'll be fully consumed by this vessel, aka the one we're playing as, because she doesn't know if this one's actually hollow. Again, I don't think the Knight is hollow either, but I'll get into that. Eventually, the Hollow Knight takes too much damage and collapses, doing its best to hold in the infection despite how much it's leaking out. The Knight absorbs the infection and is now the Hollow Knight. And the previous Hollow Knight, the pure vessel, is weakened enough, and the force of transferring the Heart of the Plague over rips apart the Hollow Knight, leading to its death. At least in this ending. I'll talk about the other endings later. I'm just saving a bunch of stuff for the section about the Knight. Please stick with me a bit longer, I apologize. The Hollow Knight is the Hollow Knight and its tale is one of extreme tragedy, and feels very FromSoft to me, if that makes any sense, and I only mean that as a compliment. A child born into a cruel and cursed and torturous existence, the Hollow Knight really did its best. My headcanon is that it knew how hellish being the vessel would be, and it tried its best despite knowing it wasn't hollow, so its father wouldn't have to make more children to suffer for its plan. From my view, the Hollow Knight is one of the many heroes of Hallownest who sacrificed so much to leave the world a better place than they found it. God, I want to write a happy AU comic thingy now. We play as the Knight for the whole game, yet we don't know much about them. This is partially because as a player character, lots of their actions are guided by us, so they aren't really meant to express themselves. We know that the Knight was strong enough to climb up out of the abyss chasm as soon as it was born, as we see it climb from underneath a pile of corpses from its siblings. But due to either a lack of speed, or probably just bad luck, it was too slow to reach the top before the Hollow Knight and was thus cast down with the rest of its siblings. Somehow, beyond all odds, the Knight managed to escape the abyss, and later Hallownest as a whole. I guess it sort of makes sense. Even if only 0.5% of 1 million vessels lived long enough to try and climb the abyss, that'd still be 5,000 that have a chance of escaping. And even if only 1% of those 5,000 get past Deepnest, that's still 50 vessels that have a chance of leaving the kingdom. So it makes sense at least one of them did, at least from a purely mathematical sense. Regardless, the Knight loses its memory in the void outside Hallownest, and that's what seems to make it more hollow than the other vessels. But in the end, the Knight is still not actually hollow, or purely hollow, at least not in the way the Pale King describes such a quality. According to the Pale King, to be a purely hollow vessel requires a being to have no mind to think, no will to break, and no voice to cry suffering. The most important of these three is the no will to break line, as the other two kind of loop back around into that one. Despite the implications that the Knight is more hollow than its siblings, we know it does have a will. The White Lady implies the Knight has a will, saying if it wills it, it will go to the abyss and find its birthplace. Jin straight up says the Knight has a will, because it can deny giving her the egg, and the Voidheart says that it unifies the void under the bearer's will in its charm description. This makes me think that even if a vessel, even if a vessel like the Knight isn't hollow after being shown no love, getting its memories wiped, etc., etc., I don't think it's possible to make a truly pure vessel. Again, this makes sense considering that the Pale King was using biological children to do this, which living things are inherently, they have minds, and or they or like or I mean, like, in this case, I'm not talking about like plants because they don't have minds, but like when you're talking about like animals, yeah, they have minds. That's how sentient things work. Uh, and the void probably didn't make them any more hollow, because we know the void itself has a will, and the wills of other beings can be imprinted on the void. Honestly, now that I think about it, the times the void manages to defeat the Radiants has nothing to do with them being hollow or not. That ties into something I want to elaborate on later. Upon gathering both halves of the King Soul charm, the shells covering up the entrance to the birthplace fall away, and you are open to explore where the knight died and was reborn. After exploring for a bit, you come across an egg, and this egg is probably where at least the knight was born from, if not all of the siblings. I really like this moment because you're not only striking your own reflection with the dream nail, but you end up striking one of the only remaining shards of your previous life before becoming a void creature, even if it was corrupted. Upon remembering its past, the void within the knight transforms the king soul into the void heart, uniting the entire void under the knight's will. This is shown in how all void-related enemies become passive, and the void beast holding the bull you get the shade cloak from calls you the Lord of Shades. I think it's interesting that while the knight can stagger and hurt the Radiance, it cannot defeat her by itself. In its current form, it cannot do enough to stop her stop her completely. It has to shed its shell and embrace its inner void, and the void of its siblings to beat down the Radiance. This is also the case in the Godhome ending. In the cutscene at the end of the Pantheon of the Night, we see the Knight and the Vessel symbolically come together as the Shade Lord to answer the call from the Radiance. Later, at the end of the Pantheon of Hallownest, the Knight's Shade breaks out of its shell and descends into the Sea of Void before the Shade Lord emerges. I think that's important. The Shade Lord doesn't appear until the Knight, rejoins the Abyss, or rejoins the Void, because the Shade Lord is under the Knight's will. The Shade Lord is the Knight, in a sense. The Void is, because at this point, it's not only united under one will, or it's not all the Void united under one will, but it's the Void as one entity working in unison. So, yeah. Sorry, I kind of went off script. This last part is going to be a bit more rambling than the others. The Vessels are a tragic group of beings. Their life was stolen from them before they were even alive, all to serve a purpose they had no choice in undertaking. I think it's even more sad that the infection could have been stopped much sooner if the Vessels were allowed to embrace the void within themselves, but the Pale King, much like your average FromSoft game ruler, was scared to let go of his world. Every time the Pale King used the void, he attempted to contain it, either in constructs or within living shells. The radiance in her light is referred to as a force of nature a few times, as inevitable as the sun rising. The only thing that could defeat a force of nature is something as equally as overwhelming. The nature of the void itself is very mysterious and vague, but since the radiance is always referred to as the light, and the void is always the darkness, I think it's reasonable to speculate that there are two sides of the same coin, yin and yang and whatnot. The sibling shades in the abyss only seem to attack us since we're still alive. Maybe from their perspective, they're just trying to either snuff out any life like Void is seen to do, or they're trying to free our shade from its shell. But in most other scenarios, the siblings seem to cooperate with each other, even if it's just out of a shared sense of duty compared to genuine care. I think it's interesting that there wasn't ever one perfect vessel there wasn't ever one perfect vessel that killed the Radiance, but it could only be done after all of them worked together. Honestly, in some ways I preferred the Dream No More ending to embrace the Void, watching all the siblings come to the Knight's aid as the Void tendrils tried to hold down the Radiance. Then once you force her to retreat enough, the Hollow Knight Shade appears and rips her open, allowing you to shed your shell and wail on her before she gets pulled down into the darkness. Maybe the Vessels could never be hollow, but they sure as hell could stop the infection. And once they did, they could all rest. A very well-deserved rest. After so many years of fighting, suffering, and anger, they were able to do what they were born and made to do. But I have a feeling that after everything, as the Knight beats the Radiance into a pulp, that it isn't doing this for its father, not even for itself, but for its family.